We were the kings and queens of promise, the victims of ourselves, maybe the children of a lesser God between heaven and hell. Heaven and hell. You know, the lyrics of that song remind us of what we experience in this life, right? That we have this sense we were meant to be like kings and queens, and we get this little taste of heaven, of the love and joy and peace and goodness and creativity and compassion and life together. And then we're also the victims of ourselves. We experience something in this life gone terribly wrong. Anger and hatred and jealousy and division and deception and alienation and dishonesty, divorce, murder, war, a small taste of hell. We live between heaven and hell. But why? And you know, we've been 4 weeks in this series. We've been looking at heaven. And if you're just here for the first time today, I'm sorry. You really need to go back and watch the last 4 weeks, because today we're going to ask the question, what about hell? And let me just say, there's no way I'm going to cover everything in this one service. And so I'm encouraging you to read along and imagine heaven during this series. In chapters 14 through 16, I really go into it more. But I'm going to try to give you a perspective that maybe you've never had before. Let me start with a story. Long before earth was created, God eternally existed. The God who is love and light and life is also a creator. And God created eternal creatures called angels. Angels were creatures of light, created to do God's will, created to love and glorify God forever. And they were given tasks. Some were messengers, some were servants. The most beautiful, powerful angel actually created music and worshiped in God's very presence. His name was Light Bearer. He was blameless, pure, creative, the seal of perfection, full of wisdom, perfect in beauty. He was placed in Eden, the garden of God in heaven. God himself appointed Light Bearer to be a guardian cherub. He was the most powerful angel, and he was allowed to go into the most holy place, the holy mountain of God. He walked among the fiery stones of brilliance. He was in the most splendid place in all of heaven, the throne room of God. God loved him and declared, "You were blameless in your ways from the day you were created." But God created the angels to love and to serve, which also meant that angels had a free will. They could choose. And something horrible happened in the heart of Light Bearer. His heart became proud because of his beauty. He corrupted his wisdom and his splendor. He said in his heart, "I will rise above the throne of God. I will be like God." And wickedness was found in him. "You were filled with violence and you sinned," God declared. "So I drove you in disgrace from the mountain of God. I expelled you, guardian cherub, from among the fiery stones." And Light Bearer, or Lucifer, was cast out of heaven. But not before he convinced a third of the angels that they could rule better than God. And so these free-willed eternal angels made a choice. They chose to reject God's will and ways and go their own way. But a choice in eternity is an eternal choice. See, when time is not linear, when time is not successive, there is no second chance. And they eternally chose not God. But the only place that God is not, God is everywhere in heaven. His light and his love and life fill all of heaven. There is no place in heaven where God is not. And so God in his love created a place where Lucifer and his angels could have what they demanded, where they could rule apart from God. He created a place called hell. A place where the light and love and life of God gives way to dark, selfish, self-centered, evil rulership of the creature trying to play God. Still, 2/3 of the angels had not eternally rejected God. So how could God show them not to do this ever again? That he could show them the consequences. God created again. God said, "Let there be light." And the universe was born out of a great explosion right in the middle of heaven. But this universe only had 4 dimensions. The angels watched and were puzzled. it's so much less than heaven. Time only moves in one direction. And instead of the glorious light of God that gives life to all, there is this dim, lesser light called the sun that life depends on. And instead of the water of life flowing from God's throne that gives life, there is this lesser substance, H2O. And they watched as God created people in his own image to be greater than the angels, eternal creatures who could love and create and serve God. But for a while, he placed them a little lower than the angels. And the angels watched as time unfolded and how God allowed Lucifer and the fallen angels access to this new creation. But why? Why would God allow them to follow Lucifer and be cast out of God's presence, cast out of Eden? Why would he let this happen again? But then the angels began to understand God's love, God's mercy. Because see, these humans only experienced a fraction of the love and grace and joy of heaven, but they only experienced a fraction of the evils and sufferings of hell. And God was hiding beyond their four dimensions, and yet always near, drawing, beckoning these creatures, these humans, back to himself. This place between heaven and hell was a place where humans, created to live eternally, began with the knowledge of good and evil. The angels marveled at God's brilliant plan unfolding. He would not abandon humans even though they rejected him. Instead, he would enter their world and pay his own price for justice and righteousness so he could forgive and take back any willing human. God gave them a second chance and a third and a fourth. 70 years of chances to turn back to God, to admit their rebellion and forever live with him. Something impossible for eternal angels who made an eternal choice in God's very presence. So God was teaching the unfallen angels and humans the cost of rebellion, the power of love. And with the knowledge of both good and evil in their collective history, when humans who chose God on earth were brought into eternity, they would forever choose to follow God freely, knowing that small taste of life without God's rule. Now, if you read these three chapters, Ezekiel 28, Isaiah 14, and Revelation 12, you see something close to the story that I just told you. And as we talk today about hellish near-death experiences and how in the world could a loving God create a place like that, I want you to keep that story in mind. I want you to keep that perspective. Because you know, many people think that hell is eternal punishment for finite sins. And so they say, how could a loving God eternally punish someone for, short time on earth? But I think they're missing the point. We are not temporal creatures being given eternal consequences. We are eternal creatures being given temporal chance after chance after chance to choose God. And if you understand this, it answers so many questions about the heart of God. Like, how could he allow so much evil and suffering in this life if he really loves us more than any other? I've told some of you this story. I remember when my daughter was 5 years old and she fell straight down and hit her head on tile and cracked her skull. And she had internal bleeding. They had to give her, inject her with dye and do a CAT scan, and they found there was bleeding under the skull, which was life-threatening. And so the next day they had to do a second CAT scan and inject her with the dye, but when the doctors went to inject her, she screamed and kicked. She was terrified of the shot. And I'm in the room, suffering as my daughter's suffering, and the doctor looks at me and says, "Dad, you're going to have to hold her down." And I was dying. I had to go and pin my little girl down as she pleaded with me, "Dad, why are you letting them do this to me? Why are you hurting me, Dad?" And I had to pin her down, and I was suffering. I was crying, and she was crying. Why would I do that? Well, because I knew this temporary suffering was necessary to prevent her death, to prevent a far greater suffering that she didn't understand. I think God sees that way too, from eternity. So, 1 out of 25 people, as we've said, have had a near-death experience. And they have died and been resuscitated and said they saw something in the life to come. And it's convinced many skeptical doctors. But when these first began to be reported about 40 years ago, initially only good stories were coming forth. And so everyone was reporting these great experiences. They felt more alive with heightened senses. They saw people who seemed friendly to them. And the researchers declared, it's all good. Everyone goes to heaven. There's nothing to fear. And then slowly, more and more hellish NDEs got reported. Dr. Maurice Rawlings was a cardiologist who did not believe in God, didn't believe in the afterlife, when a 40-year-old man had a cardiac arrest and dropped dead in his office. 3 nurses rushed in, began CPR. Dr. Rawlings recalls, I had to insert a pacemaker wire into the large vein. The patient began coming to, but whenever I would reach for instruments and stop compression, he would lose consciousness and die again. Each time he regained heartbeat, he screamed, I'm in hell. He was terrified and pleaded with me to help him. I was scared to death. In fact, this episode literally scared the hell out of me. And he said, after several resuscitations, the man pleaded, don't you understand? I'm in hell. Each time you quit, I go back there. Don't let me go back to hell. Dr. Rawlings said, I dismissed his complaint and told him to keep his hell to himself until I can get the pacemaker in it. He was serious, though, and he said, pray for me. He begged me. I told him I'm a doctor, not a preacher. Pray for me, he repeated. And Dr. Rawlings said, just to try to quiet the man, he drew on his little bit of Sunday school remembrance, and though he didn't believe it, he had the man repeat, Lord Jesus, I ask you to keep me out of hell. Forgive my sins. I turn my life over to you. If I die, I want to go to heaven. If I live, I'll be on the hook forever. The patient finally stabilized after having a few more of those episodes after the prayer. Days later, Dr. Rawlings went and asked him, what were you seeing? What was this hell you were seeing? The patient could not recall any of the unpleasant events, only the pleasant ones after he flatlined after the prayer. Rawlings reflects, apparently the experiences were so frightening they were suppressed far into the subconscious. That event not only changed Dr. Rawlings' beliefs. After doing his own research, he wrote a book called Beyond Death's Door, theorizing that many people have hellish NDEs, but they're suppressed in their memory because they're so traumatic. Now, studies show that positive near-death experiences are largely underreported because people fear being labeled crazy. So just imagine how underreported hellish NDEs would be. Despite this, of those who report near-death experiences, 23% report having negative or hellish experiences. Dutch researcher Dr. Pim van Lommel summarizes, to their horror, people sometimes find themselves pulled into even deeper into the profound darkness. The NDE ends in this scary atmosphere. Such a terrifying NDE usually produces long-lasting emotional trauma. The exact number of people who experience such a frightening NDE is unknown because they often keep quiet out of shame and guilt. That's disturbing. That disturbs me. Does that disturb you? And I mean, the thing is, most people who even do research, they don't want to talk about that. They just rather leave it alone. And quite honestly, I don't want to talk about that. I'd rather leave it alone. But then I started to think that would actually be the most self-centered, unloving thing I could ever do. Because that's about me worried about what you think about me. Not caring about you. Not caring about people. And Jesus taught that hell is just as real as heaven. He spoke of outer darkness where there's weeping and gnashing of teeth. He spoke of a pit, a black pit. He spoke of a fiery place. He spoke of a levels of a world turned away from God. Now, Jesus also made it clear God doesn't want any human going there. So why would anyone end up there? Jesus explained that too. He said, God's light came into the world, John 3:19. But people love the darkness more than the light, for their actions were evil. All who do evil hate the light and refuse to go near it for fear their sins will be exposed. But those who do right come to the light. God has made a way to forgive all of us, but sometimes because we fear that guilt and condemnation, we don't turn to God. We run from him and hide from him. Oxford scholar C.S. Lewis, who was an atheist turned believer, believes that God does not send anybody to hell. He says this, "I willingly believe that the damned are, in one sense, successful, rebels to the end, that the doors of hell are locked from the inside." Last week I interviewed Howard Storm. He's a tenured college professor who was taking students on a tour of Paris when his stomach ruptured and unable to get surgery, he died. And at first, like many NDEs, he felt great. Remember? If you were here, he felt more alive than ever. He met these friendly people, this friendly welcoming committee. If it had stopped there, it would have been like any other heavenly kind of experience. But I think that's important to realize. First appearances can be deceiving in this world and in the world to come. Listen to what Howard goes on to describe. It's a little longer story, but I think it's important to listen.
I had known from some time in that afternoon that I was dying. I knew absolutely, but I didn't want to die because I was an atheist, and I knew that I was terrified of it because dying means the end of everything. I was a 38-year-old college professor. My work was shown in some museums. I'd won some prizes. I had a wife and 2 kids, and a career. And one of the thoughts that kept going through: how could this happen? How can this possibly happen? It's not supposed to happen. And I went unconscious. I awoke from that, and I felt wonderful, unlike I'd ever felt in my entire life.
Wait, so you knew you died, and suddenly you felt great?
Well, I didn't know I'd died. I'd been unconscious, and now I feel great,
And where were you?
Standing next to the bed, upright, and the first thing I was like, why do I feel so good? I just felt the worst I'd ever felt in my entire life.
Yeah.
I couldn't breathe, and now I'm like Superman. And my eyesight, my hearing, my taste, my smell, and I'm thinking about my senses, and I can.
So you still don't know you're dead?
No.
And you feel
I haven't figured this
alive?
out.
You feel
I feel
good?
more alive than I've ever felt in my entire life. And I heard people calling me in English, kind of nicely, Howard, come here, come here. So I go over to the doorway of the room, and in the hallway is gray. It's very unclear, like a terrible black and white TV picture. And there's men and women standing far away from the light of the doorway. And I said, I'm sick, I need to have surgery, I've been waiting all day for a doctor. And they said, we know all about you, hurry, come with us now. We can't wait any longer, come, hurry. As we went, it got darker and darker, and they came in closer and closer, and more of them were around me. And now, as I asked them questions like, where are we going, how much further, things like that, they started to become more rude and say things to me like, shut up, don't ask questions, you'll find out. You don't need to know. Keep moving, move it, like that. And I'm like, getting pretty intimidated. That becomes fear. That becomes terror. And what they were doing was just playing with me, toying with me. And at first it was pushing, kicking, pulling, hitting. And then that became biting and tearing with their fingernails and hands. And they were taking pieces of me. And there was a lot of laughter, a lot of very foul language. And then they became more invasive. And I don't ever go further with this because it was so demeaning. I don't talk about it any further. And in that place, I heard a voice which I identify as my voice, except that it did not come out of my throat, off my lips. But I do feel, it's strange, but I feel like it came out of my chest. This voice said, pray to God. And I thought, I don't believe in God. I don't pray. The voice said, pray to God. And I thought, I don't even know how to pray. I couldn't pray if I wanted to pray. The voice said, pray to God.
But you couldn't find one at that point?
I found the Lord as my shepherd. And then I found, yea, though I walk through the valley of death, I'll fear no evil. Stuff like that. And our Father who art in heaven. I remember like these phrases out of prayers. And I start to mutter this stuff, and the people around me absolutely can't bear it. Now, this made me want to pray more, because for the first time I was able to hit back at them. The prayers were like clobbering them. This is the horrible part, that the people that had met me were my kindred spirit. Now, I do not know if I knew any of those people in this world prior to this experience. That's not what I'm trying to say. They were my brothers and sisters in spirit.
What do you mean by that?
They denied God, they lived for themselves, and their lives were about manipulation and control of other people. As a son to my mother and father, I had failed them. My father and I had no relationship.